I was in the studio at Juilliard, and I was sort of like with my book of CDs. This was pre iTunes and pre, iPod. I had a book of CDs that was about this thick, and and my like CD, like Discman, my Sony Discman, which was still around at that time. I love it. We're carrying around like huge like Bibles of CDs. My sister had like things this big of like not demos. What are they called? Like mixtapes. They're like mixtapes, but they were CDs. Yeah, for sure. I grew up in Westchester, New York. I was living in Briarcliff Manor for a great majority of my childhood, and then we moved to Hastings later on. I started performing. I would say I was always performing because I always used to get in front of the television and act out movies and music videos, and would constantly be doing that at home. I did a little bit of like magic. Well, there you go. I did but not like real magic, but like like magic tricks for a while. I was a member of the Society of Young Magicians, if that is the most nerdy thing I could possibly reveal about myself. But then I did a show. What did I do? I did The King and I at my high school when I was in 3rd grade because they needed kids to be the children of Siam. And that whole experience was like one of the most, eye-opening and incredible experiences. I became obsessed with the show. I memorized everything. But I don't think I was conscious of it at the time, but I was really drawn to the dance moments. Like I memorized the whole like Uncle Tom's Cabin ballet, and then I also learned the fan dance. And one day we were doing Getting to Know You, and it was just a rehearsal for the kids, and the person who was doing the fan dance wasn't there. So of course I, at 9 years old, just get up and start doing it. And my dad tells the story where he was at that rehearsal, but his back was towards the stage, and he's talking with somebody, and as he's talking, the person is just going, Larry, turn around. And he said it was one of those moments where you just go like, how does he know how to do that? And I was there just doing it.
Like perfect.
Perfect, yeah, just like, and with no fear. I was so fearless as a child. I wish I was that fearless. I mean, you lose that, of course, but totally fearless, did not mind being the center of attention, had no qualms about just getting up and showing everybody what I could do. Loved it. So that was kind of a pivotal moment, and the musical director or the music teacher who was, involved with that said at the time, like to my parents, like, you got to get him into some classes or musical theater classes. And then I went to summer camp and I did Peter Pan, the Mary Martin version, and I was auditioning, and I was like 10. I wanted to be Captain Hook, and I auditioned, but I had watched that video, the VHS tape from the 80s, like with the Oshkosh Bagosh commercials, and the Peter Pan peanut butter and the Cadbury cream eggs and the V8 episode, like the V8 commercials where everyone's walking on the side. Like I had that whole tape, commercials and the songs memorized.
Only if it's Peter Pan.
Yeah.
Oh my god, so visceral.
It's so visceral. Like that video is such a huge part of my childhood. So I knew all the songs. So when I got to the audition at camp, they were like, okay, you sang for Captain Hook, but like, can you just do a little bit of this? I was like, yeah, what number do you want? And I knew it all. So they cast me as Peter Pan, and I was very disappointed. I was like, oh, I got the lead? I want to be Captain Hook. I did not want to be Peter Pan. But I did Peter Pan, and I'll never forget just like doing it and just feeling the entire camp watching me do it. And there's a videotape of this somewhere, and I need to get it. But it was like a very like illuminating experience, because I was like, wow, I love this. This is amazing. This is like where I'm supposed to be. I'm supposed to be doing this. So on the way back, I'm driving, home from camp, and I told my parents I want to be on Broadway. And I remember them being like, okay. So my parents were great. They got me into musical theater classes. I was doing a lot of community theater, and then it was a great experience. And then an agent was at a community theater show that I was doing. I got signed. I think I did 3 auditions, and I got my first gig professionally at Madison Square Garden doing A Christmas Carol. So I worked a little bit. I mean, I was always training, and I was always auditioning, sometimes after school, and I would be allowed to do certain gigs and certain things I wasn't allowed to do. I wasn't allowed to tour or do anything that was going to take me out of school for a really like definite period. I mean, I left school for like 3 months or 2 months at a time, but I wasn't allowed to like leave and go elsewhere for too long. But I had really great experiences. I mean, I worked a little bit in theater. I did some TV. I did a little film. But it was great. It was really fun. I didn't know really what I was doing. I mean, it was just something fun, and I would audition, and it was a really good experience. And I don't know if I could do it now. I decided to leave Briarcliff school system and audition for LaGuardia and go to high school in the city for dance. And that was a conscious choice because I knew I wanted to dance, and I knew I had really a lot of gifts as a dancer, and I was more interested in training and getting a classical training in ballet and modern, which I had not had a serious amount of. I had a very wonderful ballet teacher and some modern, but I was mostly in musical theater. But I knew that even if I wanted to dance in musical theater, that I needed to have better technique and that I needed a certain kind of rigorous training. I had no real intention of going into contemporary dance. It wasn't really in my mind, but when you're all of a sudden surrounded by it, you get influenced by it, and I just sort of let the actor, singer thing go. And the next logical thing after LaGuardia was go to Juilliard. So I had a rough time in high school, and I wanted to get out early, so I auditioned for Juilliard when I was 16. They took me, and I started Juilliard when I had just turned 17, so I was really young. And I went to Juilliard and I had an interesting time there.
Yeah.
Lots of wonderful things, but a lot of challenging things. Mostly the wonderful things with the people and the teachers that I really connected with. It was a really great place to be in terms of like being around very talented people and being challenged to create things that were unique and individual, because everyone was so talented that you really wanted to find a way of being seen and heard. So you would look at what other people were doing, and it was always this like friendly competition of who would do what at the workshop performances, who would make the piece that was most out there, the thing that no one had thought of to do, or that was the most subversive, who's going to get in kind of trouble, or who was going to like do the piece where it was the first naked piece, and who was going to do the piece that had no movement in it and that was so amazing, or who was going to like use the studio with the lights off, or who was going to like start the piece in the hallway. It was fun, and I loved my class and I loved the people. I was very inspired, but ultimately I felt stifled, and it just wasn't the right place for me, and I took myself out. I was lucky. I had a huge crisis period early on, and taught me a lot about life, and not that I know everything now, but it just taught me to say no when I'm put in a situation where it's not good for me or I'm not happy.
Yeah.
And it really was very challenging because you want to do what everyone wants you to do, and as a people pleaser growing up, I always wanted to please everyone. My parents, the directors, the people who are, in process with me. So I felt this need to please everyone, and that ultimately destroyed me in a way. So eventually I just had to make the choice and say, you know what? I know you want me to do this, but I have to do this. And that's sort of how I've lived my life ever since then. My company, which is called Anatomy Occulti, started, I would say, probably under a different name, but in 2011 as Adam Barruch Dance. And that was sort of the first time I did APAP, and it was the time that I just sort of started putting my work sort of into the dance scene in New York. I had been making work for a long time, but up until that point I wasn't really ready to present. I left Juilliard and realized I wanted to make my own work, but I was very cautious about who saw it, and I worked a lot in schools and in certain teaching situations to practice my craft on younger dancers and to develop my own voice, because after I left Juilliard I was totally paralyzed in terms of movement. I was terrified to move. I was so neurotic about movement. I had no joy in movement. Juilliard was a very intense experience, and there was a lot of focus on technique and trying to fit in a certain kind of box and be this sort of universal dancer that could fit into any genre. And I think I felt a little boxed in, but I also, being very intense, just sort of allowed the environment to exacerbate my own neuroses, and I became extremely critical of myself in movement, and I became therefore terrified of making mistakes, and therefore terrified of performing because there was no safety in it. I felt this need to be absolutely perfect at all times, whether it was in class or rehearsal or on stage. So to counteract that fear, I just stopped moving. And so I started creating work that was more of a reference to my experience as an actor. I started making either work that were like sort of stylized monologues with some gestures, or that were pieces where the movement was totally emotionally driven, meaning like if it didn't have a reason to do it, it wasn't going to happen. So when I left Juilliard, I really didn't know how to move like myself, and I didn't really know also in what way I was interested in moving. And I had teachers, who said, movement is inherently emotional, and you can find a way of moving and still connect to your feelings, and it can still be theatrical. But I didn't really get it at the time. It wasn't really resonating. But then I sort of explored more, and I found choreographers that I resonated with, and was like, oh, I like that texture, I like that. And I just started to go in the studio and play with all of it, and just try to find a way that felt authentic to me. So I started creating work in a very sheltered way. I mean, I was in back rooms and back studios in Brooklyn, and working with younger dancers and teaching them, because it was a safe space. And it wasn't until 2011 where I was given the opportunity to present on a much higher scale, which was really terrifying.
How did that happen?
I was making work at NYU for a master's program, and an agent in the field saw my work and told me he didn't like the piece that I made, but was interested in seeing my other work at the time. It's like, oh wow, that's forward. But he was intrigued by what I did, even though he said he didn't like it. So I gave him a DVD, and he really liked what he saw on there, particularly a first version of a solo that I did to Sweeney Todd. So that was the beginning of that project in 2011, but I had made that solo in 2009. So it was, or 2008. It was kind of the first steps.
That's been going on forever.
Forever. It was the first idea that I had. I did a solo to Angela Lansbury's recording of The Worst Pies in London, and it was a blank table and me, and I did the whole piece, more like a Marcel Marceau, Charlie Chaplin mime version of the song. And it was more like a take on it. It wasn't meant to be literal. I was dressed as a man. I was not in drag. I didn't intend to be the character. It was sort of a funny take on it. But he saw that and was really intrigued. And so he gave me the opportunity to present work at DTW, or NYLA now, and also at City Center. So I felt very pressured to deliver. So I hired a group of 7 dancers, and we made a piece and I worked also with Margie Gillis on a solo. So I was equipped with a high-powered program. And also I was never more nervous for anything in my entire life, I don't think. I was very scared because I just had never been at that level, and I didn't know anybody, and it was the first time people were going to see all of that. So I did that. I had 7 dancers. We did really well. We got all of these opportunities, and then I didn't have that much money, or any money really, to pay people. So this person left and that person went there. So I lost a lot of people that I was relying on, and I felt like the people that I hired to replace were great, but it didn't have the same energy of the original. Mm-hmm. And I felt that I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to have to sacrifice quality, and also scheduling people was so intense. So I was I just turned to Chelsea, and I was like, you know what? You and I know no matter what, we'll go on stage and deliver. And honestly, I'm getting more of a connection and more of a thrill working with you one-on-one. And I feel like maybe I'll take commissions with companies to satisfy my group, needs, my, working with larger amount of dancers, and also I'll get money. But then we'll just do the 2 of us for a while. And that's sort of what I did for a really long time. I mean, from 2011, I think, to 2015, for 4 years, I didn't make work. on anyone else but me and Chelsea, except for with company commissions, which I was doing a lot of, so it was great. But it was just a relief because with company commissions, schedules are set, dancers are there, money is there. It's all taken care of, and you just go and you work. I definitely can say without a doubt that my work is extremely gestural. I'm pretty obsessed with arms and hands, and that's sort of where I initiate all of my movement from. There's a sort of emotional connection that I have with my own sort of limbs. And for some reason, working with geometry and architecture with my hands and arms connects me to my psychological and emotional life. So it's almost like physical storytelling through gesture, but the gestures aren't meant to be literal. I never am really doing pantomime or trying to like encode something within the arms. I think people misunderstand that a lot of the time. Like they think that because I'm inspired by a word and I create a gesture based off of that word, that I'm trying to let the audience in on that while they're watching it, and that's really not true. I guess in terms of when I'm making work that's more narrative, there might be a little more like utilitarian use of the arms in terms of wanting to represent something specific, but very rarely do I intend for a specific, word to resonate with an audience. I don't try to make them mind read, no. So yeah. So it's not like if I have a word that means flower, I'm not trying to get the audience to understand that means flower. It's something that moves me, and it's up to the audience to feel something, not necessarily overthink. I definitely have a sequential, very slippery way of moving. I love to move in a very efficient and effortless way, partially because I think I'm kind of lazy. When I move, I don't like to work super hard. I like movement to feel really good. I'm not lazy, but as a dancer, sometimes I want things to feel good. I don't really like to do things that are really difficult, or that's not the right word. Difficult is not the right word, but
held. Like there's not a lot of heldness in your work.
No, or discord. There's not a lot of discord. Like all sort of intensity or aggression is from a very holistic place. It's all about the resolution of those things rather than the maintainment of them, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
I don't like to hold on to anything and let it bottle up. I love to just send it out and let it flow, let it release, let it transform. I don't like to hold on to it, and so it's very hard for me to do work where I'm kind of engaged in that kind of fight all the time. I think a lot of the time I set material, or in the past I've set material, and when I'm working with a company I always set material. But when I'm working on my own work or working with Chelsea Banowski, who's my collaborator, very, very recently we've been starting to add a lot of more improvisational texture where not everything is completely set. But there is a vernacular that I think we both understand now that we don't need to talk about or really engage too much exploration in. We know what those kind of patterns are, so we can add them into performance and not have them set. A lot of the time I would do these improvs in my apartment and videotape them, and I was like, how come I can't bottle this? I can't quite recreate this, and I want to put that on stage because it's so interesting and it's so complex and kind of inevitable, and I want that quality, but I can't really bottle that. And so I just sort of realized at a certain point, I was like, well, maybe I don't need to bottle it, and I can just go on stage and do what I do. And that requires a little bit more bravery and risk because not everything is delineated. So, but the textures that you do get when you hit them in performance and they're improvised sometimes are mystifying because the logic is so authentic and in the moment, and you can really can't truly recreate that. You can do a lot of research and look at the video and try to get an understanding of what you did in the improv and set some things, but that real sort of organic, authentic flow through that you get with an improv is very different. And that's sort of what I wanted to try to get into the work now, partially because we've also created so much work over the last 8 years that was set. And when we went back in the studio to make new things, it was like, we've done this, we've set work.
New territory.
We wanted to go into some new territory, so we just stopped producing and started exploring. And would put on music and do like, 10-minute long improvs when we were up at the 92nd Street Y this year in residence. So it was really liberating to go into a room and put on music and just explore and see what happened.
Yeah.
I just created a new work for a contemporary dance company in Seattle called Whim Whim, and I was there for 2 weeks for an initial creation process, and then I'll be going back in August and September for another week of creation, and then a technical week in the theater and the premiere. I always have like a concept that I like to work with, or an idea of what the piece is going to be about or what's inspiring me. And then I usually have an idea of the kind of process that I'll lead them through. Luckily, I work a lot during the year with conservatories or schools, so I utilize that time to sort of work out the kinks in my process, and then by the time I'm ready to go and work with these companies, I sort of have an idea of what I'd like to do and how I'd like to create the work. For this piece, I've been very interested in creating work that's based off of ritual magic and casting spells. So I've been having the dancers generate very specific spells, and then sort of taking that material and creating a whole piece from it. I usually first just teach movement that's based in my own body, partially because most of the time I don't know the dancers and they don't really know me. They might have seen my work, but they really don't have any experiential wisdom in terms of my physical patterning. So I like to just teach them lots of phrase work and lots of gestural work that sort of ingratiates them into my lens, so to speak. And then from there, I have them generate a lot of material afterwards. And it's very rare that I utilize the material that I generate. It's more just like a springboard to get them to really understand where to go and what to shape as they're making their own material. This year I made a piece for Graham 2, and I've in past years made work for River North Dance Chicago, Ballet X, Ryrie Woodbury in Salt Lake City. I've worked with Groundworks, Ailey 2, lots of different companies. And everyone is a totally unique experience because the dancers are totally different and they're engaged in different kinds of rep. Yeah. So it's really fun to see how the work shifts. I might give the same exercises to, each group, but what they create is so different. And that's really fun because the work does shift. And my goal is not to make work really that is representative of what I would make for my own company, but a work that is unique for them and works with the intrinsic gifts of the company so that it fits in with their other rep and it fits in with their audiences as well. So the idea came at Juilliard. I was listening to Sondheim. My friend walked in. She goes, "Oh my God, I love Sondheim." And I was like, "You know about Sondheim?" It was like, felt like we were being subversive, like listening to musical theater at Juilliard or whatever. And I said, "Wouldn't it be funny if like we did a production of a Sondheim musical, but we did it with contemporary dance in it, and the actors were all moving, and doing really kick-ass, choreography instead of sort of derivative musical theater staging." And I had this idea. So yeah, what if we should do The Worst Pies in London? And she was like, great. Then after I left Juilliard, I was working with her again. I said, we should actually do it. So I had this idea that we were going to do The Worst Pies in London, and she was going to dance it, and I was going to have all these people being arms for the character of Mrs. Love, and have a rolling pin and flower, and just do it more I guess traditionally, but do it more musical staging. And then I went into the studio and I had a table, but I forgot all my props. So I was like, let me just pretend I have it. And I just started to improvise with it, and was doing it without props. And I watched the video back and I started laughing because I had unintentionally created a mime-based work. And I thought it was funny that I was doing it and not a woman. So I said, okay, screw the other idea. I'm going to do it myself, and I'm going to do a solo, to The Worst Pies in London without props. And that was sort of amazing because it was a real moment where I was like, this is a cool idea. And then when I had originally performed it, a mentor of mine said, you know, you really should just do the whole show. And I was like, you're crazy. I don't know how that would happen. And I really didn't at the time. I was like, how would I do the whole show? But I knew instinctively that to have the music playing from the CD and do a whole evening to the soundtrack of Sweeney was not interesting to me, because there was so much in the show that I was like, it doesn't need to be danced all the time. And to do, and like well, I won't say who it was, but somebody once said, you know, you should do like a pas de deux to Nothing's Gonna Harm You. And I was like, vomit. I was like, that's the worst possible idea. Like, that's exactly what I don't want to do. Like putting point shoes and like doing nothing, like, no. So I was like, but I really didn't understand how I was going to do it. And then as years went by, I just thought, well, if we do it, the only way I could imagine it being done is if the performers sing and act their own roles, but movement is a huge part of the mode of storytelling. So I thought, well, if we just got rid of the sets, got rid of the costumes, got rid of the props, and everything had to be based off of the body, that would be a really great idea. So that's just been, you know, in the back burner. And then when I was given a residency in 2015 in Santa Barbara, California at the Libero Theater, I was like, now I have money and I can really work on anything that I want to work on. And I said to myself, I've done a ton of pieces for companies. I don't really need to do an abstract dance piece. Let's work on Sweeney Todd. So that was sort of how that came to be. She had asked me, the woman, Diane Vapanek, who started Dance Works Santa Barbara, amazing, incredible woman, so generous, and really has given so many artists an incredible opportunity to make work in this way. There was no stipulation on what I had to do. I could do anything I want. And there were really no performances. There were 2 public showings at the end of the process, but it could be a work in progress. It's whatever you did. So I didn't feel like I had to finish the show. But she said, if you can get the rights to do it, do it. So I had already had a little bit of a relationship with Sondheim, because I had asked for the rights to do the solo, because I was asked to perform it so often when I started to do it in 2011. And in a really long, convoluted way, he saw a video of the piece, and I didn't really feel it was right to be, you know, doing this piece and being compensated for it without having the rights. I just felt like that's not kosher. For me, at least, I have too much respect for him as an artist to do that. And he's aware of it, so I might as well, you know,
do it the right way.
Do it the right way. And it was important to me that I did. I never in a million years thought he would ever see it. It was never my goal, or ever in my head. People said, oh, you should send it to him, but that's sort of like sending something to Santa Claus, or, you know, it's like, yeah, I don't know where he lives. It's like, right, it's like, dear Santa, North Pole, and sending it in the mailbox. I don't know how to do that. I mean, I probably could have figured it out, but I didn't have any connection. And because of at a performance at a Dancers Responding to AIDS benefit, a casting agent for Broadway, Stuart Howard, saw it, and he actually sent it to Sondheim, and then sent me a message with a response that Sondheim really liked it. And so I was just sort of in shock, you know. And then I asked Stuart to send a message from me asking for the rights, and he was extremely lovely and said, of course, I'm going to put you in contact with my lawyer and you two can set up an agreement. And it was a very generous situation. And also I was sort of shocked that they were like, you're one of the only people that's ever really gone about it this way. So I think I kind of did myself a favor by doing that. And when I got the residency, I wrote to the lawyer and Sondheim and said, this is my idea. Can we do this? Is this okay? There are no real shows. And they said yes. It was very organic. I mean, I really had some reference points before I came into the studio with the whole group. I had done a little demo recordings, if you will. I had put some contemporary dance videos, and I had changed the music and put Sweeney just to see what it would be like to put that kind of movement on top of that score. For example, in the Epiphany and also in the Ballad of Sweeney Todd, there are a lot of rhythms that for me were very similar to the Rite of Spring. So in my head I thought, I wonder what would happen if I put Pina Bausch's Rite of Spring on top of the Ballad of Sweeney Todd or the Epiphany. And it was kind of uncanny because the rhythms are so similar that the movement looked like it was meant for Sweeney Todd. And it was almost like everyone who saw it would just laugh because it was so ridiculously fitting. And I mean, it was like these, people in the dirt, and they're all. And so for me, it was a really wonderful, way into it. And I thought, okay, that's really great. At least like the textures work with that music. So I first started to generate more abstract sections that I just started to develop movement for. And then it was such a whirlwind. I really don't remember how a lot of it was generated. I remember asking the performers to create textures and gestures for their characters, and we started to start with, asking them to stand as their character, to start moving as their character, and working on different extremes, being the character at 1% versus 100% physicality. So that was my way into it. And then I had ideas. I was like, wouldn't it be great if this was like a machine, or if this was like an extension of Sweeney, the razors are just an extension of his arm. And I just basically proposed ideas, and we worked together to kind of codify them. And it just was a very natural, very organic, productive process. And that month in Santa Barbara was perfect. There was nothing about that month in every way, personal and professional, that was not perfect. It was a very charmed experience. I mean, being in Santa Barbara, so beautiful, having the money to do what you need to do, having this amazing cast that we had, working on Sondheim every day, being close to the beach. I mean, there was nothing about it that was bad. It was perfect. And then, of course, the shock of afterwards, going back to New York and having no money and not having a chance to go back in the studio to continue it, it was a huge letdown, because that was just this glorified month of, beauty. And it was over. It was done. And I didn't know when I wanted to return to the material, because the process of doing it was so beautiful. I don't think I would have been able to have been very objective about what we made. So I really waited a long time. And I also wanted to get to a place where I felt like I cared so much about the dancers as people, but I also wanted to get to a place where I wasn't feeling like I was doing the project solely to facilitate something for them. I know that sounds kind of harsh in a way, but I was so in love with all of them, and I felt this great need to just get the process going again, because I just wanted to facilitate that experience again, but I wanted to do it right. I mean, when I work with people, I really open up, and I love people that I work with, if they're, generous and it works, I really love these people. So that, just to be around that and to have that in your life is really important. But at the same time, it was really important to me, like I said, that the process would have been a good one for everyone. And it wasn't just because I wanted to get and recreate what we had in Santa Barbara. Also, to not have any space to have kept going, it wouldn't have evolved. We would have kept making things, but it wouldn't have changed or evolved into something more specific, or I wouldn't have had the ability to go, let's take that and cut it. Because I would have been too in love with and attached to the material. So a year later, when we finally got back in the studio, I had the chance to let it go, not look at it, and then go back and say, that worked, that didn't. Let's cut this. We don't even need that anymore. And then it was like, we distilled it into something that felt really clear. And when we worked on it a year later, we didn't add anything. We just looked at everything that we had done and said, is this as clear as we can make it, or this doesn't really work, or I don't like that anymore. So it clarified it by having the space, for sure. The next stage, we're going to be doing a 2-week residency in Lake Placid at Lake Placid Center for the Arts, and we're going to start working on Act 2. We've pretty much done most of the musical material from Act 1. There are certain songs that we didn't cover, but they're songs that really don't need a tremendous amount of musical staging or choreography. They're pretty much just more traditionally done, and more character driven, so they'd be easy to stage because they don't require a lot of density. But we have not done anything from Act 2, and Act 2 is extremely challenging because the sequences are long they're really convoluted, plots are crossing, characters are crossing. We have the mechanism of the chair, which we've never done, so we have to figure out how we're going to do that. And lyrically and musically, the sequences are very complex, especially for Mrs. Lovett. She has a really, verbally dense role always in the show, but the opening of the second act is just she's this where and this place, and she's all over, and there's a lot of work for her. It's a very challenging role, because it's very, I don't know, Sondheim is very famous for his patter songs, and she's got a ton of verbiage. I don't know if Broadway would be the proper place for it, but off-Broadway for sure. I would love to see it off-Broadway. I think it needs to be in an intimate space, because it's a chamber piece, essentially. It's only like 10, 11 people. The piano is the only instrumentation, which I did on purpose. So it's scaled down, and it needs to be experienced in an intimate space, or even a non-traditional space in how it's set up. So I don't know if Broadway is the right space for it.
A huge budget.
Yeah, and that's the thing is that it would be kind of an inexpensive show besides the rights, because we have a table, a chair, and that's it, and everything else is movement based. So we'd need some really great lighting. Lighting would be probably a really key element in the staging, and we haven't really also figured out a design element, so to speak, for it. And there's also this idea of, and I haven't really decided this yet, there's an idea that it can be totally done where movement is the thrust, and there's no, I would say, structure in terms of why it's happening with movement. We played a little bit with Sweeney Todd being this ritual, that the reason why we're enacting it with our physical body is because it's some sort of ritual or reenactment, a fable, so to speak, that needs to be done in some sort of dark rite or some sort of, secret society that comes and every year retells the story, and it's about sacrifice. And so there was that kind of underlying idea. I don't know how far we'll go into that. It's something that I still need to figure out. I tend to be inspired by very dark things. I think that's my father's fault. He has a very dark sensibility. He loves horror movies. He loves the supernatural. He had books on the occult and witchcraft growing up, and I didn't really notice that until I got slightly into my teen years, and I was like, why do we have these books on our shelves? Like, I always knew that he loved darker things, but I was like, why are there so many books on the occult? And he actually did one of his, I think theses, I don't know what the right word is, one of those. He actually did one of his papers in college on Wicca. He was studying religion, so he did it on Wicca, which is sort of an interesting choice for, a baby boomer from Long Island, meat potatoes kind of guy. But he's so interested in all these things. So I think I was always sort of surrounded by that. I had a fascination for it as well. I'm also really fascinated by mysticism and sort of the underlying structure for how things operate in the universe, and that has always also been a fascination for me. So I think anywhere where those things kind of connect, I'm always inspired by. But yeah, I tend to be more gothic. I'm like a gothic romantic in a way. I love romanticism, and I love, a kind of, I don't know if it's flowery, but I like things that are ornate and romantic and lush and emotional, but I also at the same time like, gothic and dark sides of things, and I find that just more interesting. I love electronica. I think it's so three-dimensional, and I like music that feels like it's a specific, almost like cinematic or a specific, headspace in a way. And for me, electronica really can do that because it's so multi-dimensional. But I love artists who utilize that, especially in pop music. If people go through a phase where they utilize a lot of electronica, I'm always inclined to follow them at that point. So like Bjork is someone that I adore, also because she mixes with really lush romantic strings and that kind of instrumentation, which on the other end of the spectrum, I love that too. Like I love, Ravel, and I love very like French, impressionist music, and so anything that kind of mixes, as Sondheim is very inspired by Ravel as well. So and Debussy in many of his works. So I like that kind of crossing. Like if an artist has a period where they did like Madonna, Ray of Light music, Kylie Minogue, Impossible Princess, like that. I'm very stuck in the late '90s sometimes. But then I love jazz. I love jazz, and I love jazz singers. So Amy Winehouse is someone that I adore. She's sort of a newer addition. I came to her quite late, but and I love everything that she did. But I also really like her early period when she was doing more jazz-based work. But I love her later stuff too. I love some show tunes in there. So I kind of I love Steve Reich. I love sort of minimalist music as well. So I have a really Barbra Streisand. Couldn't live without her. Although I haven't really been listening to her, but she got me through a very specific time of my life. I like her from the '60s. So it runs the gamut. If something's good, it's good. Well, my first teacher, Mark Ruhala, who had the studio in Hastings that I went to, that my mom sent me to, very much a wonderful force in my life. I learned a lot from him because he was very exploratory and non-traditional with how he taught children. He was doing a lot of heart-centered transformational energy work at the time, so that was sort of fusing with his work in theater when he would work with us, and I didn't really know what that was, but he was very into also talking about emotional things, social things. Like if we were having a rough time as a group, he would come into ballet, feel the bad energy, and say, "We're not dancing until this gets resolved. We can't do good work unless you talk to her about this, because this is bad energy, and I will not engage with this. We need to transform this." So it was a very holistic and organic approach to theater that was more about the individual experience and more about the growth as a human being through the vehicle of theater, not the product, and not that everybody in this school was going to be a professional in the theater. It was about using the medium of dance and acting and singing to transform as people and make people responsible for themselves and emotionally, stable and open and, thoughtful, and he didn't like, tension, and he didn't like people who are closed-minded about other people, and so it was always a conversation if he felt that there was an inequity in how we were treating each other. So it was a very different kind of approach to when I would go and audition and work in the commercial theater. So when I was young, I was getting both. I was working in the professional theater in a very different kind of setting, and then I would go back to the studio, which was my home, and work on craft, but also work in an environment that was very experimental in a way. He would bring in people from, Berlin, and we would do, dance theater when we were like, I was 10, I was feeling, a woman's breast and rolling down her body and in jeans and, throwing people to the floor. I didn't know at the time that was so special, but it was. So he's very much in my life. I have a few people, from LaGuardia, Stephen Weinstock, who is an accompanist and choreography teacher at LaGuardia. He worked with me on a lot of scores for a while. He's one of my, close friends and someone I look to for inspiration. He's a genius. He's also a science fiction writer. Has this 11-book series that he's working on about sort of like the Scheherazade and past life work and all these characters that have shared past lives. And he has the whole thing mapped out. He's very smart. Andra Corvino and Alexandra Wells, two teachers from Juilliard who I'm still in touch with. Margie Gillis, who I work with a lot from Montreal, is super inspiring, and I've been so blessed to work with her and choreograph on her and have her mentor me. She's someone that I'm very simpatico with in terms of our work. It's very different, but we understand each other and what we're trying to do. As an artist, I really am super inspired by her and her energy and the way she lives her life as an artist and how she treats people too. She's so extraordinarily generous and kind to all people engaged in work, and in a very selfless way. It's been nice, they all started as my teachers and then mentors and now friends. They've transformed as I've gotten older, and now I'm probably the age, that they were, maybe some of them when, at least Mark, when he first met me. The rest of them are probably slightly older, but yeah, to be, now in their position soon, but to have them in my life as friends now, and to just be able to share with, they're very important to me. Last year, almost exactly a year ago, in Bryant Park, we were going to do Belladonna on the stage at Bryant Park, which is not an easy stage to dance on because it's in the middle of Bryant Park and with the backdrop of 6th Avenue as, the back of the stage, and a fountain and Le Pain Quotidien stand over there. And we were doing Belladonna, which was a very intense piece and not really appropriate for that setting. So I was very worried about it, and I almost didn't want to do it. I was like, this is not going to read. People are going to be weirded out by this. And so I thought, well, whatever, we'll do it. It'll be over, and that's that. The show started maybe 6. As soon as the show was about to start, rain. It's coming in from Jersey. We saw it coming. I was like, quite honestly, oh, well, if this gets rained out, fine, whatever, it's fine. But then started raining, and I was like, damn it, we have all these really great people here who came, and I kind of want to do it now because we've rehearsed this for 2 weeks. And I just had this idea. I looked in front of the stage, and I saw this huge patch of dirt and gravel. And I thought, and it was raining, I said to Chelsea, wouldn't it be so badass if we just did it down there in the dirt? I said, would you do that in the rain and do it with me? And she was like, of course. I was like, we're going to get covered. We're going to be a mess afterwards. She's like, I'm down. So I went to the producer and I said, can we do it down there? And she's like, if you want to dance in the dirt, by all means. So we had about 5 minutes. We took all the props, put them out, and we just started. And it was the most magical experience to be rained on and then in the dirt. And it was really how the piece was meant to be, because it takes place in a garden. And we initially had thought of it at the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, but it never worked out, and we just did it, in a proscenium situation. So we went and we did it, and it was so magical to have people standing really around us, very close, very intimately, with their umbrellas, and we got wet and we were dirty, and it was, it was also one of those moments where you have to think so in the moment because the elements are new. We had never done it. We'd never prepared for it, so we had to be so in tune with each other. And there was a part of it, I remember Chelsea was on the floor laughing during it because it was so ridiculously amazing to do it. And it was one of the most happiest times on stage I think I've ever had. I had one other moment that was sort of similar. It was, again, it wasn't really in a professional setting, but I went back to Briarcliff Manor to perform when I was in high school, to go back and perform for a dance show that they were doing. They had started a dance program. And so they asked me to come back because I had gone to LaGuardia. And I choreographed this duet to Luck Be a Lady. It was Frank Sinatra and Chrissy Hind from his Duets album. And I was working with a friend of mine. And I choreographed this, in my basement, and we did it. And it was so incredible because we both were professional dancers who were from Briarcliff, and we did it. And it was just so much fun, and we really gave it. And I was so into Fosse and so into jazz at the time. That was my specialty at the time, and we nailed it. And I remember just the energy that we had, but also the response of the crowd. I remember it was one of those moments where you're, you get off the stage, they're still applauding, and there's no break because they're going into the next piece, but they're still applauding, and you're backstage, and they're still applauding. And it was just one of those moments where you feel you've done good. And it's just so joyful. Whenever I feel liberated to move and I don't feel nervous, I have an aha moment. And usually they're more improvisational moments, or there are things that are more off the cuff that I feel that kind of aha. So that's why I'm turning now more into scored work than set work, because that's when I have a more authentic and liberating experience, when I'm in the moment. And that's really why I had the moment with Chelsea, because it was so in the moment, and you have to really be present. And I think I have a lot more fear now performing than I used to. So when I have less fear and I'm kind of in experiencing a real truthful, authentic moment on stage, I have like this like, whoa, this is incredible. Yeah. Or, you know, like when I, you know, a lot of my cast from Sweeney was from Sleep No More, and they would do the shows at the bar, and they'd ask me to come guest at the bar, and that's like my dream job, is being a lounge singer. So to be able to do that, number one, is thrilling, but also to be completely, I mean, those shows were thrown together with no rehearsal and totally off the cuff and really improvised, and they're so fun. I have a love-hate relationship with New York. I mean, I love it. It's a great city. I feel like myself when I'm here. I feel like I can be myself in New York. I find it a very challenging city. I'm lucky in the sense that I grew up here, so I have connections. I have an understanding of a certain community that I've lived through and with, you know, all these years. So when I need work, I can ring people up and go, I need some work, can you hire me? Or, you know, there's a community that I can rely on. At the same time, it's a very challenging city. It's very expensive, and I find that a huge challenge in terms of making work, because, you know, I'm trying to make a living and I have to take jobs to make a living, but I also want to work on my passion projects, and it's a real juggling act for sure to be an artist here and to make everything that you want to make happen. Because of the freelance nature of things, you're always wanting to get something from what you've done, and there's a kind of a need for that, because in order to survive, you need to make people aware of what you're doing. But I think when it only becomes about what's next, what am I going to get from this, how am I going to, you know, become more relevant, how do I get to the next step, you lose a sense of joy in it, and it becomes a different kind of practice. So I try to find that balance where, yes, I'm concerned about getting work, but at the same time, if that doesn't come, I'm not lost, and I can find other ways of figuring it out. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah.
But I try to be much more centered about the whole race of everything, because it's easy to get caught up in, you know, how am I doing? Am I making good things that people like? Do I feel like I'm relevant in what's happening? How do I stay relevant as I'm getting older and my body necessarily doesn't fall into the same places it does? How do I make work when I see a younger generation dancing in a way that's completely different than how I was at that age, and how I will never be because I'm too old? So how do I stay current? How do I keep going forward when my experience as a dancer is changing? And not in a way that is about staying relevant, but just how do I stay relevant for myself? And how do I keep evolving and keep changing and growing? Because, you know, I make a lot of work, and I'm constantly working, and I love that. But it's easy to do the same things over and over and over again if you're not pushing yourself to, and some pushing yourself to change, but some of that also is pushing yourself and to go into realms where you may not be popular, and you may not be making work that's resolved, or making work that feels finished or that people understand, and that's okay. And being okay with that, that's a challenge for sure, to be authentic to where you are in your process, no matter what people think about it.